She knelt in the dark with her hands buried in the rot, and above her, the Nebraska sun was killing everything green for 60 miles. The air in the cellar was cool and damp, a small mercy against the furnace of the August afternoon, but the truth of the moment pressed against her ribs like a stone. The compost under her fingers was warm with living heat, the straw packed tight in long wooden beds that she had built with her own hands, and nothing was happening. 6 weeks of hauling, mixing, misting, watching, and the dark gave back only silence. It was the 3rd year since her father had gone. The Bell homestead sat 3 miles east of Kearney, a quarter section of flat brown earth that he had broken with a single-bottom plow and the kind of stubbornness that only the very poor or the very foolish can afford. He had been both. A winter fever took him in February of '79, and Annie, then 26 and unwed, inherited the land and the debt that lay on it like frost. $40 owed to the Kearney Bank, due each autumn, hanging over the farm like weather. Her mother had died when Annie was 9. Her 2 brothers had gone west to Oregon and never written. So the land was hers, all of it, and the loneliness was hers too, and she had no one to ask for advice or comfort or a second pair of hands. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the quiet women, the stubborn farmers, the underdogs who built something from nothing when everyone said it couldn't be done. This is the story of Annie Bell, a woman who learned that the land gives its greatest gifts not to those who fight it, but to those who stoop low enough to see what it offers in the dark. Now, picture her there, kneeling in that cellar, her hands in the compost, her lamp sputtering on the step above. She was not a woman given to dramatics. She had buried her parents, watched her brothers leave, and learned to live on eggs and cornmeal and the thin comfort of her own company. But that afternoon, with the heat pressing down outside and the crop refusing to come, she felt the full weight of the town's laughter press against her back. It had started small. She had found a book, a water-stained agricultural pamphlet traded from a peddler for 24 eggs, with a chapter she read 40 times by lamplight. It described how the French grew a thing called the champignon, in the dark, in caves and quarries, in beds of straw and well-rotted manure, harvesting food in winter when the fields lay dead. Annie had folded the corner of that page. She had started to wonder. The wondering became doing on a gray afternoon in March when she hauled the first wheelbarrow of composted manure down the cellar steps, and the Hartman boy saw her do it. He told his father, and his father told the feed store. And by Sunday, the whole settlement knew that the Bell girl was carting muck and rotted straw into her house cellar instead of out of it, packing it into long wooden beds like garden rows, watering it and covering it, doing the whole performance in the dark. The widow Castellano cornered her after church. "Child," she said, not unkindly, "what in heaven are you growing down in that hole?" "Mushrooms," Annie said. The word landed in the churchyard like a dropped plate. Someone laughed. By Monday, the laughing had spread, and Annie Bell had become the settlement's favorite foolishness. For weeks, she nearly quit. It is one thing to be private and odd. It is another to become the joke that travels 3 miles in every direction. The Hartman children took to calling out, "Toadstool," when she passed their fence on the way to town. At the feed store, Mr. Lindquist weighed her flour with a smirk, pulling at his mustache, and asked, loud enough for the other customers, whether she'd be paying in poison this season. The men by the stove laughed into their coffee. The hardest part was that some of it touched her own doubt, because the truth was that for the first 6 weeks, nothing happened. The beds sat dark and silent and smelling of barn. Annie went down every morning with her lamp and her hope and found exactly what she'd found the day before. Wet straw, dark compost, nothing more. She had spawned the beds with bits of soil from beneath the cottonwood log by the creek, where the wild, pale shelves grew, crumbling that living earth across the manure the way the pamphlet described. But the pamphlet had been written for France, for caves she had never seen, and who was she to think the same magic would happen in a hole in Nebraska clay? Her only comfort was old Peter Voss. He came by in April, leaning on the fence and watching her with eyes that had seen 60 years of farming in the old country before the sea took his fields and sent him to America with nothing but knowledge. He did not laugh. He came down the cellar steps slowly, his old knees protesting each one, and he stood a long while in the lamplight with his nose working like a hound's. "Smells right," he said finally. "Smells like the dark should smell." He pressed a thick thumb into the bed. "Not too hot now. Too hot and you cook the life out of it. You watching the heat?" She was. She had buried a thermometer in the bed and fretted over it like a sick child. "Then you wait," Voss said. "Waiting is the whole of farming. The rest is just chores." But waiting cost money she did not have. The corn she had planted that spring needed rain that did not come. April was dry. May was drier. Annie stood at the edge of her field watching the young corn and doing the arithmetic of survival. How many baskets of eggs, how many pounds of butter, how much she could carry alone against $40 owed in October. The mushrooms were a gamble she was no longer sure she could afford. Twice she stood over the beds with a shovel, ready to turn them under and plant something sensible. Both times she didn't. She told herself she would give it one more week. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. That week ended on a Tuesday, and on that Tuesday Annie went down the steps already composing the apology she would make to her own pride. She held the lamp over the nearest bed. The straw was no longer empty. Threaded all through the dark surface, fine and white as spilled thread, ran a delicate living lace spreading across the compost in every direction. And here and there, pushing up through it, were tiny pale buttons no bigger than peas, domed and perfect, and unmistakably alive. Annie sat down hard on the bottom step. She put her hand to her mouth. The lamp shook in her other hand and threw the small miracle into dancing light. It had worked. The dark was feeding her. That was the moment she made her absurd decision stick. The decision that would make her the laughingstock of the county before it made her its salvation. She did not stop with one bed. She built a second, then a third. She expanded into the old smokehouse. She bought more manure, more straw, more lamp oil, spending the egg money she could not spare on a gamble that had only just begun to show a sign of life. She worked by lamplight until her hands were raw and her back ached, and she learned the language of the dark, the way the mycelium breathed, the perfect dampness, the heat that must never climb too high. The town watched her digging and hauling and shaking her head, and they laughed harder than ever. But Annie Bell did not hear them. She was listening to something else now, the quiet, patient pulse of the underground economy she had begun, a harvest that no drought could touch, no sun could wither, no mocking voice could slow. She had stooped low, and she had found what the land was offering, and she was only beginning to understand what it would mean. The harvest came like a tide. Once those pinhead buttons decided to grow, they grew with a speed that astonished her. Annie would twist a perfect white mushroom free in the morning, its cap as broad as a silver dollar, and by evening 3 more had swelled up in the spot where it had been. The beds breathed them out. She filled a basket, and then another, and then she had no more baskets and had to set the surplus on clean straw in the corner, because she could not pick fast enough to keep up. She had no idea at first what to do with such bounty. She fried them in butter with salt and ate them standing at her own stove, and the taste stopped her where she stood. Meaty and rich and deep, like the best part of a beef roast without the beef, a flavor that filled the mouth and the belly both. She who had been living thin on eggs and cornmeal ate until she was full for the first time in months, and laughed out loud, alone in her soddy, at the strangeness of being fed so well by a thing the whole town called poison. But the town, that was the trouble. She had a crop and no buyers because she had spent 2 months becoming the settlement's joke, and you cannot easily sell food to people who have decided you are foolish. The first time she carried a basket into Kearney and set it on the counter of the dry goods store, Mr. Lindquist looked at the heaped whitecaps the way a man looks at a snake in his boot. "I'll not poison my customers," he said. "They're no more poison than your potatoes," Annie said. "The French eat them by the ton. The fine hotels in New York serve them. There. This isn't New York, Miss Bell." She carried the basket home. She gave half of it to her hens, who at least had no opinions about her character, and ate the rest herself, and lay awake that night doing arithmetic that came out wrong no matter how she added it. But Annie Bell had not packed muck into a hole in the ground by being a quitter. If Kearney would not buy, she would find someone who would. She had heard that the new railroad hotel in Grand Island, 20 miles east, had a French cook, an actual Frenchman, brought in to feed the railroad men and the through passengers who expected something finer than beans. A Frenchman would know a champignon when he saw one. It took her the better part of a day to get there. Greta's milk money spent on the train fare, a basket of her best mushrooms packed in a bed of cool, damp moss. She walked into the kitchen of the Palmer house with her heart going like a trip hammer and asked, in a voice she had to force steady, to see the cook. He came out wiping his hands, a small dark man named Monsieur Reynard, with a wizened face that had spent 40 years being unimpressed. He looked at her. He looked at the basket. And then his whole face changed. He lifted a cap from the basket and turned it in the light. He smelled it. He broke it, looked at the clean white flesh, smelled it again. He said something in French that Annie did not understand, but that sounded unmistakably like a man finding water in a desert. "Mademoiselle," he said, "where did you get these?" "I grew them," Annie said, "in my cellar near Kearney." He did not believe her. She could see he did not believe her. Fresh mushrooms in June on the Nebraska plains, where everything edible was either canned or salted or hauled in from the east. It was not possible. And he told her so. So Annie explained the beds, the manure, the straw, the dark, the cool clay, the misting, the patience. She talked for 10 minutes while Monsieur Reynard listened with his arms folded and his eyebrows climbing. When she finished, he was quiet a moment. "I have not had fresh mushrooms," he said slowly, "since I left Lyon, 11 years. I pay top dollar for dried, and they are like eating shoe leather." He set the cap down gently, as if it might bruise. "How many can you bring me?" "How many do you want?" "All of them," said Monsieur Reynard. "Every one you can grow. And I will tell the cook at the Grand Pacific in the city, and he will want them too." He named a price per pound. Annie kept her face still with enormous effort. It was 4 times what corn would bring. That summer became the strangest and happiest of Annie Bell's life. She had a buyer, then 2, then 3, as Monsieur Reynard's word spread along the rail line to every hotel cook who had been making do with leather-dried imports. The Palmer House took a basket twice a week. The Grand Pacific in the city wanted whatever the Palmer House did not. A dining car operator on the Union Pacific who fed wealthy through passengers on their way to the mountains began buying a standing order. Annie's mushrooms, packed in moss and ice in the early mornings, rode the rails east in the cool of the baggage car and arrived at white-clothed tables the same day. The money was real. That was the thing she could hardly believe. She had a tin box under a floorboard in the soddy, and through June and July it filled with coins and bills in a way her egg and butter money never had. She paid off $4 of the bank debt early, just to watch Mr. Halloran the banker's face, and his face did not disappoint her. But the work was relentless, and Annie threw herself into it with a joy that surprised her. She learned the rhythm of the beds, how to read them. She learned that a bed gave its heaviest flush for about 10 days and then needed rest. So she built a second set of beds, and then a third, staggering them a week apart so that the dark never stopped producing. She turned the old smokehouse into a second growing room. She enlisted the Castellano widow's eldest, a serious boy of 14 named Bartholomew, who needed work and asked no embarrassing questions, and paid him in coin to help her cart compost and haul baskets to the morning train. Peter Voss was beside himself with quiet pride. He came nearly every day now, and the two of them would stand in the lamp-lit dark, surveying the white acres of it, for it did feel like acres packed into those underground rooms. And he would shake his old head and murmur in Dutch. "You see it now," he told her one evening. "The land offered you the dark. Everyone else, they fight the land. They want corn. The land says no corn. They fight and they lose. You looked at what the land had, cool dark and old straw, and the leavings of a cow, worthless things, and you made it the most precious thing on the plains." He chuckled. "The cleverest farmer is the one who stoops to pick up what others step over." Word got around Kearney, of course. It always does. The same neighbors who had called out "toadstool" over the fence began to take a sudden close interest in Annie Bell's affairs. The Hartman father stopped her on the road one day, his red face working with the effort of being friendly to someone he had laughed at, and asked, casually, oh so casually, how exactly a person might go about starting such a thing in their own cellar. Annie, who had a longer memory than she let on, smiled and said she would be happy to explain it sometime, and somehow never quite found the time. Mr. Lindqvist at the dry goods store, who had called her crop poison to her face, now found himself in the position of a merchant whose customers were riding 20 miles to Grand Island to eat in a hotel dining room, and coming home talking about a remarkable dish made from something grown right here near Kearney by that Bell girl. He did not apologize, but he did, the next time she came in, weigh her flour without the smirk and throw in a paper of pins he claimed was on the house for a good customer. Annie took the pins. She was learning that being right is its own kind of reply, and that you do not need to make a person say sorry if the world is already saying it for you. By the end of July, the tin box held more than the whole $40 of the debt, with a good deal left over. Annie sat at her table one night and counted it twice, and then she sat very still in the lamplight and let herself feel something she had not felt since her father died. The loosening in her chest of a fear she had carried so long she had stopped noticing its weight. She was going to keep the farm. Not just keep it, make it thrive. She thought briefly of her brothers in Oregon and of writing to tell them. Then she decided she would rather they read about her someday in a newspaper. She slept well that night. Outside, the sky was hard and clear and starry, and had been clear for too long, though she did not yet think anything of it. It had not rained since the middle of May. Annie had been so deep in the dark of her cellars that she had half stopped noticing the sky. But Peter Voss noticed, and one morning at the end of July he stood in her dooryard and looked east across the plains with an old man's weather eye, and he was not smiling. "This is not a dry spell," he said. "I have felt this before. In the old country, the year the wells failed. The air has no give in it. Look there." He pointed at the Hartman corn north of them. It should have stood shoulder-high and green. It stood waist-high and pale, the leaves beginning to roll themselves into tight tubes against a sun that would not quit. "Drought," he said. "A bad one is coming." It came, and it came without mercy. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. Day after day after day, the sun rose into a white, cloudless, pitiless sky and hung there pouring heat onto the plains until the ground gave up the last of its moisture and began to crack. The cracks in the Hartman field grew wide enough to swallow a man's hand. The corn that should have been making ears simply stopped, the stalks paling to straw, the leaves curling and crisping and finally rattling in the hot wind like something already dead. It was not only the Hartmans, it was everyone. The whole settlement, the whole county, every proper farmer who had laughed at Annie Bell from behind his straight green rows now stood at the edge of his field and watched those rows turn to tinder. The widow Castellano's vegetable garden, her pride, the source of half her table, the beans shriveled on the vine, the squash blossoms dropped without setting fruit, the lettuce bolted and burned. The soil went to gray dust that blew away on the wind. The town wells dropped. People hauled water from the river in barrels, and the river itself was sinking, brown and slow and lower every week. By the middle of August, it was no longer a matter of profit, but of food. The gardens that fed the settlement's own tables were failing. A family could not eat its withered corn. The root cellars that should have been filling for winter stood empty because there was nothing to put in them. Talk at the feed store turned from crops to a harder question. What were people going to eat come the cold? With the gardens dead and money short, and the price of hauled-in food climbing every week as the drought widened across the whole region. And down in the cool clay dark beneath Annie Bell's soddy, where no sun could reach, and the damp never failed because she carried the water herself, the white mushrooms went on growing exactly as they always had. The Cellars did not know there was a drought. That was the wonder of it. The thing that turned Annie's situation inside out in the space of a few weeks. Her crop had never needed the rain. It had never needed the sky at all. While every field in the county died under the sun, Annie's harvest came up out of the dark in basket after basket after basket, fresh and white and full of food, utterly indifferent to the disaster overhead. The hotel orders, if anything, increased, for the drought was regional, and fresh produce of any kind had become precious along the whole rail line, and a reliable supply of fresh food was worth more than ever. Monsieur Reynard sent word that he would take double. Annie expanded again, into the barn, building beds wherever she could keep the dark and the damp. But the closer trouble was at home, and it had a complicated shape, because the same neighbors who had mocked her were now quite simply hungry, or going to be. And they knew, every one of them, that the foolish bell girl with her poison crop was the only person for 60 miles whose food had not failed. The Hartman father came first. He stood in her dooryard with his hat literally in his hands, his red face gone gray and tight with the particular shame of a proud man. And he did not ask how to grow mushrooms now. He asked if she had food to sell. He had 6 children. His corn was gone. His garden was gone. His money was nearly gone, what with the price of everything climbing, and winter was coming. Annie stood in her doorway and looked at the man whose children had called her toadstool across the fence all spring, and she felt something complicated move through her. Not triumph exactly, though there was a little of that, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. But mostly she felt the weight of a question she had not expected to have to answer. She had a cellar full of the only food in the county. She had a town full of people who had laughed at her. What was she going to do with that? The easy thing, the thing a smaller person might have done, the thing some part of her was certainly tempted to do, was to make them pay. Pay in coin, and pay in pride both. She could have named a price that emptied the Hartman pockets and let the man stand there and feel every inch of his old contempt come back on him. The hotels were paying top dollar. She could have told the settlement that the city tables came first and the locals could buy what was left at city prices, or do without. It would have been within her rights. No one could have called it unfair. She had built this out of nothing while they laughed. But Annie thought of her father, and of Peter Voss, and of what the long, lonely winters had taught her about what a person actually wanted to be when she was finally able to choose. She sold the Hartman father a basket at a fair price, a kind price, and she did not say one word about the spring. And when he tried awkwardly to thank her and to apologize in the sideways manner of a proud man, she only said, "We're neighbors, neighbors eat," and sent him home with an extra handful for the youngest child, who she happened to know was poorly. After that they came steadily, the whole settlement, down the road to the Bell place, not to laugh now but to buy. And some, the ones with no money left at all, simply to ask. And here Annie faced the real test of the thing. The one that had nothing to do with the drought or the mushrooms, and everything to do with the kind of woman 2 hard years alone had made her. She would not gouge them. She set 2 prices quietly in her own head. A true market price for the hotels and the families who could pay it, and a price near to nothing, or to nothing at all, for the families who could not. She let the Castellano widow who had cornered her in the churchyard but had also, she remembered, been the only one to ask her question without cruelty, take what her household needed in exchange for honey and for help in the beds. She fed the Schmidt family, whose father was laid up with a broken leg, for the price of their boy's labor hauling water. She made sure no child in the settlement went without protein on the table that autumn, and she did it without ever once making a hungry parent grovel for it. Word of that spread too, and it spread faster and stuck deeper than the word about her money ever had. The settlement's idea of Annie Bell underwent a second and more total reversal. She had gone, in the space of one cruel summer, from the foolish girl who grew poison in a hole to the only farmer whose crop survived. And, this was the part that mattered, the woman who had fed the town when she might have fleeced it. There was, of course, a complication, because there always is. As the drought ground on, and Annie's reputation and her tin box both swelled, certain interests took notice from farther off. A grain and produce dealer named Mr. Cyrus Pratt came out from Grand Island in a fine buggy, a heavy, smooth man who had made his money on other people's hard seasons, and he made Annie an offer. He would buy her entire operation, the beds, the methods, the hotel contracts, all of it, for a sum that made her tin box look like pocket change. He would, he explained, scale it up properly, run it as a business, supply the whole region. She could walk away rich and never haul a barrow of muck again. It was a great deal of money. For one long evening, Annie genuinely considered it. But Mr. Pratt, in his smooth way, had let something slip. He spoke of the local families as a market to be managed. He spoke of the fair and kind prices Annie had set as money left on the table. He saw the cellars and the hungry town and the contracts, and what he saw was a season to make money on, the way he had made money on every hard season before. He saw, in short, exactly what the proper farmers had seen in their fields, and it would fail him exactly the same way. Annie said no to Mr. Pratt. She was glad of it for about 3 days. Then she went down into the main cellar on a gray, hot morning and stopped at the bottom of the steps, with the lamp raised, and her stomach dropped clean away. The largest bed, her oldest, most productive bed, the one that supplied the standing hotel orders, was wrong. The white webbing had gone slack and grayish. A faint, sour smell hung over it that did not belong. And across the surface, in spreading patches, a sickly greenish mold had taken hold overnight, creeping through her beautiful crop like rot through fruit. She touched a mushroom, and it came away soft and brown in her fingers. Something had gotten into the dark. Annie sat on the bottom step for a long time in the lamplight, and let herself, for once, be afraid. She did not know what the green mold was, or where it had come from, or how far it would spread. She knew only that it was in her best bed, and that the beds sat close together in the warm dark, and that whatever sickened one might sicken all of them. She thought of the hotel orders she could not fill. She thought of the Hartman children, and the Schmidt family, and the whole hungry town that had, in the space of a month, come to lean on her cellars, the way a county leans on its one good well. She thought of Mr. Pratt's smooth, certain face, and his fine buggy, and how easy it would be, even now, to wire him, and take his money, and let it become his problem. She had built the only living thing for 60 miles, and now it was dying in the dark where no one could even see it die, and she did not know how to save it. The loneliness of that came down on her hard, harder than the churchyard laughing ever had. She had no brother to ask, no father, no book that covered this, just a hole in the ground, full of sickness, and a town full of mouths. She put her face in her hands. The lamp burned low. And then, somewhere in the dark, beside her fear, a small, stubborn voice said, "Ask Voss." She found the old Dutchman in his garden at dawn, drawing water for his few surviving plants, and the words came out of her in a rush. The gray webbing, the sour smell, the spreading green. Peter Voss set down his bucket and was quiet a moment, and then, to her astonishment, he almost smiled. "Green mold," he said. "Yeah, I wondered when it would come. It came in the old country too, in the cellars. It is hungry for the same dark you are." He looked at her steadily. "It is not the end, child. It is only a problem. And problems," he picked his bucket back up, "problems have answers. Come, I will tell you." What Peter Voss told her over coffee in his small, clean kitchen was not magic, and that was exactly why it worked. The green mold, he explained, was a thing that lived as the mushroom lived, in the dark, in the damp, in the rich, rotted beds. It thrived where the air went stale and the heat crept up, and the same earth was used too long without cleaning. It spread by invisible dust, drifting from bed to bed on the still cellar air. And the more crowded and careless a grower got, the faster it would take hold. Annie had expanded fast through the summer, packing beds close, working them hard, hauling tools and barrows from the sick rooms to the healthy ones without a thought. She had, without knowing it, built the mold a highway. But it could be beaten. It had been beaten in Holland for 200 years, and Voss remembered how. First, he said, the sick bed must go. All of it, out of the cellar entirely, every scrap of straw and compost carried up into the killing sun and the open air, where the heat and light that murder your mushrooms will murder the mold just as surely. Burn what can be burned. Spread the rest thin in the sunlight far from the cellar mouth. Do not, he said sternly, carry so much as a handful of it past a healthy bed. He went on. The cellars needed air. The mold loved stillness. Moving air was its enemy. She must cut new vents, prop the doors in the cool of the night, and let the dark breathe. Not so much as to dry the beds, but enough to keep the air from going stale and sour. Third, cleanliness, fierce and constant. Separate tools for separate rooms. Lime washed over the bare clay walls between crops, the way a dairyman limes his milk house. The beds rotated and rebuilt with fresh compost, never run on and on until they soured. And a little salt brine, he told her, brushed along the bed edges where the green liked to creep, would hold it back. "You did nothing wrong that good farmers have not all done," Voss said, refilling her cup. "You grew greedy with success, and the dark punished you for it, as the land always punishes greed. Now you grow careful instead. That is all. The careful grower beats the mold every time." Annie went home and went to war. She and young Bartholomew worked from dawn to full dark for 3 days straight. They tore out the whole sickbed and a good margin of the beds around it, hauling barrel load after barrel load up the steps and out into the merciless August sun, spreading it thin in the far corner of the home field, where the drought that had ruined everyone else now became, for once, her ally. The same brutal heat that had cracked the county's fields baked the green mold to harmless dust. They burned what would burn. They scrubbed the cellar walls with lime until Annie's arms shook. They cut 2 new vents through the clay and propped the doors each night to let the cool, dark air move through. She made the hard call to sacrifice the standing hotel orders for 10 days, wiring Monsieur Reynard the plain truth, that she had a sickness in part of her crop and would not ship him a single biscuit she would not eat herself, and that she would rather lose the contract than lose his trust. She braced for his anger. What came back down the wire was a single line. "An honest grower is rarer than a good one. We will wait. Reynard." The healthy beds, freed of the crowding and the stale air, breathed and recovered. The new beds she built clean, with fresh compost and limed walls and salted edges, and air moving through the dark, came up white and perfect and untouched. Within 2 weeks, the green was gone, beaten back into the sunlight where it died, and the cellars were producing again. More carefully now, more wisely, but producing. And here the drought, which had nearly broken the whole county, finished the job of making Annie bell. For the dry summer ground on into a dry autumn, and the failed gardens stayed failed, and the price of fresh food along the whole region climbed and climbed. Annie's cellars, clean now, well-aired, rotated and tended with everything Voss had taught her, became the single most reliable source of fresh food for 100 miles. The hotel contracts held and grew. New buyers wired from as far as Omaha. The tin box under the floorboard gave way to an actual account at the Kearney Bank, where Mr. Halloran, the banker who had once held her $40 debt over her like weather, now stood up when she entered and called her Miss Bell in a voice with respect in it. She paid the debt in full and burned the paper in her own stove. But the part that Annie herself counted as the real victory was none of the money. It was the autumn evening when the settlement, the same people who had laughed her out of the churchyard, gathered at the Hartman place for a harvest supper that, in a year when nearly nothing had been harvested, was largely made possible by what had come out of one woman's dark cellar. There was a mushroom dish at the center of the table, cooked by the widow Castellano from Annie's crop, and there was not a soul in that room who called it poison now. The Hartman father stood up, red-faced and clumsy and sincere, and said a few words of thanks to a neighbor who had fed them when she might have done otherwise. And the whole table looked at Annie Bell, and the looking was nothing at all like the laughing had been. Peter Voss, beside her, leaned over and said quietly in his accented English, "You remember what I told you 2 springs ago? Smart folks learn to want what the land is already offering." "I remember," Annie said. "The land offered you the dark," the old man said. "And you, child, you were smart enough to want it." He raised his cup of cider to her, his old eyes bright. "The whole town fought the sky and lost. You stooped down low into the ground, and you won everything." Annie raised her cup back to him. Around them, the warm room was full of light and the smell of good food and the low sound of neighbors who had finally, fully come around. Late that night, Annie went down the cellar steps alone. the way she had 1,000 times, and stood at the bottom with a lamp raised. The dark stretched out before her in long, clean rows, breathing now through the new vents, cool and damp and faintly sweet, and rising up out of it everywhere, pale and perfect and impossibly alive in a county where everything green had died, came her white crop. Basket upon basket of it, still pushing up through the straw, fed by nothing but darkness and patience and a stubborn woman's refusal to want what everyone else wanted. She had knelt here once with her hands in the rot, and the whole town had agreed she had lost her mind. Now the same town had eaten from her hands. But even as she stood there in the quiet of her victory, a new sound reached her from above, the clatter of hooves and wheels on the hard-packed road, arriving at a late hour that meant trouble. She heard a man's voice calling her name, urgent and unfamiliar. She climbed the steps slowly, the lamp casting her shadow long across the cellar wall, and opened the door to find a dusty rider on a lathered horse, a telegram in his hand. "Miss Bell," he said, breathless, "message from Omaha. Your buyers, the Grand Pacific, they've had a fire. The whole kitchen gone. They're canceling every order, indefinite." Annie took the telegram, the words blurred in the lamplight. She stood in her dooryard, the drought pressing down from every side, the town's full weight still leaning on her cellars, and she realized that the victory she had just celebrated was already a thing of the past. The only market that paid the high prices was gone, and winter was coming. Annie read the telegram 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Kitchen destroyed by fire. All orders canceled until further notice. Will wire when operations resume. It was signed by the manager of the Grand Pacific, not Monsieur Reynard. The Frenchman's quiet loyalty could not outrun a burnt building. The train that had carried her mushrooms east every morning would carry nothing now but empty crates. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. The rider waited, shifting in his saddle, expecting some response to carry back to the telegraph office. Annie looked past him at the pale August sky, the same sky that had not given rain in 3 months, the same sky that had cracked the earth and withered every field in the county. She had built her small kingdom in the dark, safe from that sky, and now the sky had found a way to reach her anyway, not through drought, but through a spark in a kitchen 100 miles away. "Thank you," she said to the rider. No reply. She went back inside and sat at her table. The lamp was still burning, though morning had come full. She stared at the wall and did the arithmetic that had become her constant companion. The hotel orders had been paying her 4 times what corn brought. Without them, she had only the local trade, the families who bought from her at the kind price, many of whom could barely pay even that. The tin box under the floorboard held enough to last the winter, if she was careful, but not enough to keep buying compost and straw and paying Bartholomew for his help. And the beds were still producing. The dark did not know the Grand Pacific had burned. The white buttons kept pushing up through the straw, patient and indifferent, and every basket she did not sell was a basket that would rot. She could stop. She could let the beds go fallow, seal the cellars, and live on her savings until spring, when the drought might break and the fields might recover, and she could plant corn like everyone else. It would be the sensible thing, the thing a woman alone ought to do. But Annie thought of the Hartman children, 6 of them, who had eaten her mushrooms 3 times a week since August. She thought of the Schmidt family, the father still on crutches, the mother thin and hollow-eyed. She thought of the widow Castellano, whose honey had run out when the flowers died, and who now traded her labor for food. If Annie stopped, what would they eat? The river was too low to fish. The game had moved north. The stores in Kearney were selling flour at double the spring price, and it would climb higher as the drought stretched on. She could not stop. The town had laughed at her, but the town was also hungry, and she was the only one who could feed it. She went down to the cellar and stood before the beds. The air moved through the new vents, cool and clean. The white webbing spread thick and healthy across the compost. The green mold was gone, beaten back by lime and salt and patience. The dark was whole again, and Annie made a decision that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. She would keep growing, keep harvesting, and she would sell to the settlement at cost, just enough to cover her supplies and Bartholomew's wages, and she would trust that something would turn up before the tin box ran empty. Word spread fast. Annie Bell, who could have sold her mushrooms to Omaha and grown rich, was instead selling them to her neighbors for pennies, accepting eggs and firewood and promises in place of coin. The Hartman father came by with a hind quarter of venison he had managed to shoot, the first fresh meat he had brought home in weeks, and insisted she take half. The widow Castellano brought jars of pickled beets from her dwindling pantry. Even Mr. Lindquist, who had called her crop poison, sent his boy over with a sack of flour and a note that said nothing but was clearly an apology. The drought did not break. September came, and the sun kept burning. The cornfields stood brown and dead, never having made a single ear worth harvesting. The wheat that some had planted in hope had failed before it reached knee-high. The river dropped so low that the mill could not turn its wheel, and the town's supply of ground flour depended entirely on what could be hauled in by rail. And then, in the third week of September, the rail line itself began to falter. A derailment east of Grand Island, caused by heat-warped tracks, shut down service for 4 days. When service resumed, the prices had climbed again. The town's merchants began to ration. Annie's cellars kept producing. She had 8 beds now, staggered across 3 rooms, and she had learned to read each one like a clock. She knew which bed would flush on Tuesday and which on Friday. She knew how much to mist and when to rest. She had become a master of the dark, and the dark rewarded her with a steady, quiet bounty that never stopped. But the pressure on her was growing from another direction. Mr. Cyrus Pratt, the grain dealer from Grand Island, had not forgotten her. He sent a letter by post, then another by messenger, then appeared at her door in person, stepping down from his fine buggy with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Bell," he said, removing his hat, "I hear you have had some difficulties with your larger accounts." Annie stood in her doorway, arms crossed. "I have enough to get by." "Getting by is not the same as thriving," Pratt said. "I am prepared to make you a new offer. Lower than the first, I admit, the market has changed, but still a fair price for a woman in your position. You could walk away with cash in hand and no worries about winter." "And what happens to the town?" Annie asked. Pratt smiled. "The town will manage. It always does." "No," Annie said. Pratt's smile tightened. "You are being prideful, Miss Bell." "Pride does not fill a belly in January. Neither does selling out to a man who would let my neighbors starve," she said, and closed the door. She leaned against it, her heart pounding. The tin box had less in it than she would have liked. The winter loomed. And yet she could not bring herself to hand her cellars over to a man who saw the settlement as a market to be managed. She would rather go down fighting. October came, and with it a change in the weather that no one had expected. The furnace of the summer did not ease into a gentle autumn. It snapped, suddenly and violently, into a cold that arrived like a thief in the night. One morning Annie woke to frost on the grass, and by the end of the week the temperature had dropped 40 degrees. The wind shifted north and brought with it a sky the color of old iron. The first blizzard hit on the 15th of October. It came without warning, a wall of white that turned the world inside out in an hour. Annie was in the barn when it struck, and she barely made it back to the soddy, the snow so thick she could not see her own hand. She sat by the stove through the night, listening to the wind scream, and wondering if the cellars would keep their warmth. In the morning, she waded through drifts up to her waist to check the vents. They were clear. The dark was unharmed. The beds were growing. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it cleared, the plains lay buried under 2 feet of snow, and the temperature stayed below 0 for a week. The rail line was blocked completely. No trains came. No supplies arrived. The town of Kearney, already reeling from the drought, found itself cut off from the world, with winter just beginning. The feed store ran out of flour in the first week of November. The general store had coffee and salt, but little else. The families who had not put away enough food, and who could have, with the gardens dead, faced a long, cold countdown to spring. And Annie Bell's cellars kept producing. She had never stopped. Through the cold and the snow and the isolation, she had carried water from the well, kept the vents clear, and tended her beds with the same steady discipline she had learned from Peter Voss. The mushrooms grew in the dark, indifferent to the blizzard, indifferent to the frozen world above. They grew white and firm and plentiful, and Annie had more of them than she could eat, more than she could sell, more than she knew what to do with. She opened her door to the town. She set up a table in her dooryard, shoveled clear of snow, and she sold mushrooms for whatever people could pay. A few pennies, a promise, a bundle of firewood, a jar of preserves. She did not turn anyone away. She gave baskets to families with nothing, telling them to pay when they could. She watched the fear in their eyes ease, just a little, when they saw the whitecaps piled high. The Hartman father came with a sled and 6 children, all of them bundled in coats that were too thin. He stood before Annie's table, his face raw with cold and shame, and he said, "Miss Bell, I don't have money. I don't have anything, but my children need to eat." Annie looked at the children. The youngest, a girl of 4 named Martha, was coughing. She had the thin, peaked look of a child who had not had enough to eat in weeks. "Take 2 baskets," Annie said, "and bring Martha inside. I have a warm place by the stove." The Hartman father's face crumpled. He tried to speak, but the words would not come. He nodded, and he carried his daughter into Annie's soddy, and he sat by the fire while Annie fed the child broth made from mushroom stock. That night, after the Hartmans had gone home with their baskets and their warm bellies, Annie sat alone in her kitchen and counted her tin box. She had enough to last maybe 2 more months, if she was careful. After that, she would have nothing. The winter could last until April. She could not feed the whole town on her savings, but she could not stop feeding them either. She had seen Martha's face. She had seen the Hartman father's eyes. She could not unsee them. She went to bed with a heavy heart, and she dreamed of the dark, of the cool, patient dark that had given her everything, and that now seemed to be asking for everything in return. The next morning there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find the widow Castellano, wrapped in a shawl, holding a jar of honey she had somehow managed to keep through the summer. "Annie," the widow said, "I have been talking to the neighbors. We know what you are doing. We know you are giving away food you cannot afford to give." She pushed the honey into Annie's hands. "We are taking up a collection. It is not much, but we will not let you go under. Not while you are feeding our children." Annie stood in the doorway, the jar of honey warm in her hands, and she felt the tears come for the first time in years. She did not cry. She blinked them back, but something in her chest loosened, not the fear, not yet, but the loneliness that had wrapped around her since her father died. She was not alone anymore. The town that had laughed at her was now holding her up, in its own small, clumsy, grateful way. The collection did not amount to much. A few dollars, some eggs, a side of bacon from a family that had been hoarding it. But it was enough, just enough, to buy another load of straw and manure from the livery stable. It was enough to keep the beds going for another month. And that month, if the weather held, might be enough to reach spring. But the weather did not hold. In December, a second blizzard struck, worse than the first. It brought snow that drifted over the rooftops. The cold sank to 20 below, then 30. The well froze. Annie had to melt snow on the stove for water. She cut back the misting, afraid the beds would freeze, but the cellars held their temperature, just barely, by the grace of the deep clay and her own relentless stoking of the stove above. She lost one bed. The corner nearest the outer wall went cold, and the mycelium stopped, and the compost froze into a black, dead lump. Annie hauled it out and burned it for fuel. The loss cut into her harvest just when she could least afford it. But the other beds held, and the mushrooms kept coming, thinner now, slower, but still coming. The town held on too. On Christmas Eve, Annie went to the church for the first time since her father's funeral. The service was held by candlelight, the congregation shivering in their coats, the stove struggling against the cold. The widow Castellano sat beside her. The Hartman family filled 2 pews. Mr. Lindquist was there, his mustache drooping, his eyes tired. And there, in the back, standing alone, was Peter Voss, his old face lit by the candlelight like a weathered carving. The preacher gave a short sermon about provision and gratitude, and Annie found herself staring at the altar, thinking about the dark beneath her own home, the living white threads spreading through the compost, the food that came from nothing but rot and patience. She thought about the French caves and the Dutch cellars and the old knowledge that had crossed the ocean and found its way into a pamphlet and then into her hands. She thought about the long chain of small choices that had brought her here, to this frozen town, to this candlelit church, to this moment of quiet, improbable survival. When the service ended, Peter Voss found her at the door. He took her hand in his cold, gnarled fingers and said, "You are the reason they are still here. Every last one of them. Do not forget that." Annie squeezed his hand. "I could not have done it without you. You would have found a way," he said. "You have the dark in you, child. It does not quit, and neither do you." She walked home through the snow, the stars hard and bright above, the cold biting through every layer. She lit the lamp and went down into the cellar. The beds stretched before her, white and quiet, breathing. She touched a cap, cool and firm, and she felt the life in it, the stubborn, patient life that did not know about blizzards or canceled orders or empty tin boxes. It only knew how to grow. She would find a way. She had to. January came, and with it the deepest cold anyone could remember. The river froze solid. The rail line did not run at all. The town became an island of snow, and every family in it depended, in whole or in part, on the mushrooms that came out of Annie Bell's cellar. She had become something she had never expected to be, the heart of a community that had once rejected her. And then, in the middle of January, a new trouble arrived. A cough on the wind. A fever that spread from house to house. Sickness. Several of the Hartman children took ill. The Schmidt father relapsed. The widow Castellano's bees died in their hive, and she herself grew pale and weak. Annie worked harder than ever. She carried baskets of mushrooms to every sick household. She brewed broth and carried it in jars. She sat with Martha Hartman through a long night of fever, feeding her spoonfuls of warm liquid, praying to a God she had not spoken to in years. The sickness passed. The town survived. But Annie's tin box was nearly empty, and the winter showed no sign of ending. January wore on like a long sickness. The cold did not break. The snow did not melt. The sun rose pale and distant, giving light but no warmth, and by 4 in the afternoon the darkness had returned, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Annie had not been to town in 2 weeks. The drifts were too deep for walking, and Greta the milk cow had gone dry from the cold, and the barn cat had disappeared one night and not come back. She was alone again, but differently now. The loneliness of the early years had been a loneliness of being forgotten. This new loneliness was the loneliness of being needed by too many people and having too little to give them. Every basket she sent out of her cellar was a basket she could not replace. Every family she fed was a family she might have to turn away next week. The tin box was empty. She had counted it 3 times, hoping she had missed a coin, but the arithmetic was unforgiving. $4.37 remained, and she owed Bartholomew $2 for his work in December. She paid him, and he looked at the coins in his palm and then at her face, and he said, "Miss Bell, you need this more than I do." "Take it," she said. "You earned it, and tell your mother I will have a basket for her on Friday." He nodded and left, and Annie sat at her table and put her head in her hands. She had not told anyone how bad it was. She had kept the fear tucked inside her apron pocket, next to the empty space where the money used to be. She had smiled when the Hartman children came to her door. She had spoken cheerfully to the widow Castellano. She had carried broth to the Schmidt household and told them not to worry. But the truth was that she could not afford another load of straw. She could not afford to replace the lost bed. She had been feeding the beds with the last of her compost, stretching it thin, and the harvest was shrinking. The mushrooms still came, but they came slower, smaller, fewer. The dark was giving her everything it had, and it was not quite enough. She went down to the cellar on the last day of January and stood before the remaining beds. There were 4 now, down from 8. 2 had been lost to the cold, 1 to the mold that had returned briefly before she beat it back again, and 1 had simply stopped producing, exhausted by overwork. The 4 that remained were healthy, but they were not producing the way they had in the summer. The mycelium was alive, but it was tired. Annie could feel it, the way a farmer feels the weariness of a field that has given too much. She knelt and pressed her palm to the surface of the nearest bed. The compost was warm, the webbing white and fine, but she knew it would not last another month at this rate. She had to find a way to replenish the beds, to buy new spawn, to give the dark a rest. But there was no money, and there was no end to the winter in sight. She climbed the steps and closed the cellar door behind her. The soddy was cold. She had been burning the last of the coal sparingly, saving it for the nights when the temperature dropped below zero. She sat by the stove and wrapped her hands around a cup of hot water, pretending it was tea. A knock came at the door. She did not want to answer it. She was tired of being strong, tired of smiling, tired of being the woman who had saved the town. She wanted to be left alone to fail in private. But the knock came again, insistent, and she rose. It was Peter Voss. He stood in the snow, leaning on his cane, his beard crusted with ice. Behind him, hitched to a sagging sled, was a mule Annie had never seen before, loaded with sacks. "What is this?" Annie asked. Voss did not smile. He never smiled when he had something important to say. "The town took a collection," he said. "Not the little one from before, a real one. I told them you were running out. I told them what you had done for them, and they gave what they had." He gestured at the sled. "There is straw from the livery stable, manure from the Hartman's barn, a sack of lime from Mr. Lindquist, and a letter." He pulled an envelope from inside his coat and handed it to her. It was thick, and it was addressed to Miss Annie Bell in a careful, schooled hand. She opened it. Inside was a bank draft for $40 from the Kearney Bank, signed by Mr. Halloran, and a short note. "Miss Bell, the town has taken up an account in your name. This is the first installment. We will not let you go under. You are the reason any of us are still here." The citizens of Kearney. Annie read it twice. She looked at Peter Voss. The old man stood in the snow, his eyes bright, his breath pluming in the cold. "They did this," she said. "They did," Voss said. "Every family who could spare a penny put one in. Even the ones who laughed at you in the spring. Even Mr. Lindquist. Especially Mr. Lindquist, I think," he chuckled. "He told me to tell you that he was wrong about the poison. He said to tell you that you are the best farmer in the county, and he is sorry it took a blizzard to make him see it." Annie stood in the doorway, the bank draft in her hand, and the tears she had held back for so long finally came. She did not try to stop them. She let them fall, hot and grateful, into the cold air. She used the money to buy fresh compost and new straw. She rebuilt the lost beds. She gave the dark what it needed, and the dark responded the way it always had. Within 2 weeks, the harvest was back to full strength, white and plentiful, pushing up through the beds like a promise. The winter did not break, but it began to loosen its grip. February brought a thaw, then another freeze, then a slow, grudging warmth that turned the snow to slush, and then to mud. The rail line reopened in the middle of the month, and the first train to come through Kearney in 6 weeks carried not only supplies, but a passenger. Monsieur Reynard stepped off the train in a heavy coat, his wizened face pinched with cold, and he walked the 3 miles to Annie's soddy without waiting for a ride. He found her in the barn, mixing compost, and he stood in the doorway and watched her work. "Mademoiselle," he said. Annie turned. She had not expected to see him again. She had assumed the Grand Pacific contract was gone forever, and she had made her peace with it. "Monsieur Reynard," she said. "The kitchen?" "Rebuilt," he said. "Better than before. And the new manager is a man who understands that quality matters more than convenience." He stepped forward. "I have a new offer for you. A contract for the entire season, all you can grow, at the old price, plus a premium for the months we lost." Annie set down her shovel. "How did you find me?" Reynard smiled. "I asked in Kearney. Everyone knew where you lived. Everyone had something good to say about you." He paused. "That does not happen by accident, mademoiselle. That happens when a person chooses to be more than just a farmer." Annie looked at the compost on her hands, the straw on the floor, the dark mouth of the cellar door behind her. She thought of the long winter, the empty tin box, the town that had collected pennies to keep her alive. And she thought of the offer, the money, the chance to finally be secure. "Yes," she said, "I accept." Reynard nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. "I will send a wagon every Tuesday and Friday. Pack them in moss, the way you did before, And mademoiselle," he added, his voice softening, "I am glad you did not burn out. An honest grower is hard to find." He left, and Annie stood alone in the barn, the weight of the winter lifting from her shoulders like a coat she had worn too long. She had survived. The town had survived, and the dark was still giving. She went down into the cellar and stood in the lamplight, watching the white caps push through the straw, and she felt something she had not felt in months: hope. The next morning, a delegation arrived at her door. The Hartman father, the widow Castellano, Mr. Lindquist, and a dozen others. They came with a gift, a new cast-iron stove, the finest the general store had to offer, paid for by the same collection that had bought her lime and straw. They set it up in her soddy while she stood by, wordless. Mr. Lindquist, his mustache drooping with the effort of what he was about to say, cleared his throat. "Miss Bell," he said, "I was wrong. I called your crop poison. I refused to sell it in my store. I let the town laugh at you, and I laughed with them." He took off his hat. "I thought I was protecting my customers, but I was protecting my pride. You fed this town when no one else could. You fed my family. My grandchildren ate your mushrooms, and I never thanked you." Annie looked at him, the dry goods man who had smirked at her, who had weighed her flour with a sneer, who had thrown in a paper of pins like it was charity. He stood before her now, hat in hand, his face red with shame. "Thank you," Annie said. "That means more than you know." He nodded, put his hat back on, and shuffled away. The others followed, one by one, each offering a handshake or a nod or a word of thanks. The widow Castellano embraced her. Peter Voss, last of all, took her hand and held it. "You see now," he said, "you built more than a crop. You built a family." Annie watched them go, the long file of neighbors trudging back through the mud to their own homes. She turned and looked at the new stove, shining in the afternoon light, and at the cellar door, and at the fields beyond, still bare and brown but beginning to stir with the first hints of spring. She had knelt in the dark with her hands in the rot, and the whole town had agreed she had lost her mind. Now, the whole town was standing at her door, not to laugh, but to thank her. The dark had given her everything, and she had given it back. A wagon creaked down the road. She recognized the driver, a young man from Grand Island holding a letter. "Miss Bell," he called, reining in. "Message from the Palmer house. Monsieur Reynard says to double the order for Friday. They have a banquet planned." Annie took the letter. She looked up at the sky, still gray but softening at the edges. She looked at the cellar door, standing open, the cool breath of the dark rising up to meet her, and she smiled. The story was not over. It was just beginning. The wagon from the Palmer house arrived on Thursday morning, and Annie stood in her dooryard watching it come, trying to swallow the knot in her throat. Monsieur Reynard had asked for double the usual order, and double meant 12 baskets, nearly 100 pounds of mushrooms, the largest single harvest she had ever attempted. The banquet was for a visiting railroad magnate and his party, and the eyes of every hotel kitchen in the region would be on what came out of her cellars. She had worked since dawn, picking each mushroom by hand, twisting the stem clean, laying the caps in beds of fresh moss. Bartholomew had stayed late the night before, helping her mist the beds and check the temperature. Peter Voss had come by at sunset and stood in the cellar with his arms folded, saying nothing, which meant everything. The beds had given everything they had. The last 4, stretched thin from the winter, had flushed harder than she had dared to hope, as if the dark itself knew what was at stake. Now the mushrooms sat in the wagon, packed in layers of moss and damp cloth, gleaming white in the gray morning light. The driver looked at them and whistled. "That's a pretty sight, Miss Bell. Never seen anything like it." "You will see more," Annie said. "Tell Monsieur Reynard the next order will be ready on Tuesday." She watched the wagon pull away, the horses leaning into the trace, and she felt the weight of the winter finally begin to lift. But the weight was replaced by a new kind of tension, the tension of hoping that the banquet would go well, that the magnate would be impressed, that the contracts would hold. She had fed the town, but the town could not pay the kind of money that would keep her farm alive for another year. The hotel orders were her future, and this banquet was the first test of that future. She spent the next 2 days in a state she had not known since her father died, restless, unable to sit still, picking at her food. She went down to the cellar a dozen times, though there was nothing to do. The beds were resting. The harvest was gone. All she could do was wait. On Saturday evening, a messenger arrived on horseback, his coat dusted with the first mud of the thaw. He handed her a letter sealed with wax. Annie broke the seal with trembling fingers. "Mademoiselle," the letter read, "the banquet was a triumph. The magnate ate 3 helpings and demanded to know where the mushrooms came from. I told him everything: the cellar, the drought, the blizzard, the town that laughed and then ate its words. He sends his compliments and wishes to place a standing order for his private car on the Union Pacific. I am raising your price by 10%. Reynard." Annie read the letter twice, then 3 times. She sat down at her table, the paper fluttering in her hands, and she let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the first blizzard. She had done it. She had not only survived, she had built something that would last. The news spread through Kearney faster than a prairie fire. By Sunday morning, everyone knew that the Bell girl, no, Miss Bell, had impressed a railroad magnate, that her mushrooms were going to be served on the finest trains in the country, that the farm that everyone had laughed at was now the most talked-about operation in the region. The Hartman father came by after church, his hat in his hands, his face red with something that might have been pride. "Miss Bell," he said, "I heard the news. I just wanted to say, we always knew you had it in you." Annie smiled. "That is generous, Mr. Hartman. I seem to recall a different opinion last spring." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Well, I was wrong. We were all wrong, and I am glad to say it." He left, and Annie stood in her doorway, watching the muddy road, the bare trees, the sky that was finally beginning to soften toward spring. She thought about the long months of loneliness, the laughter, the hunger, the cold. She thought about Peter Voss and his patient wisdom. She thought about the widow Castellano and her honey, about Bartholomew and his silent loyalty, about Mr. Lindquist and his apology. She thought about the cellar full of white life, breathing in the dark, waiting for her. And she thought about her father, who had dug that cellar deep into the clay, who had believed in the land even when the land broke him. She wished he could see it now. The wagon from the Palmer house came again on Tuesday and again on Friday. The orders grew. The standing contract with the Union Pacific private car meant a steady income that would carry her through the next winter, and the next, and the one after that. She hired Bartholomew full-time and added a second boy to help with the hauling. She built 2 new cellars, one under the barn and one under the old smokehouse, and she lined them with lime and cut vents and filled them with compost and straw and patience. The settlement watched her rise, and this time the watching was not the laughing kind. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, with weeks of mud and cold rain before the first green shoots appeared. The drought had broken in February with a series of gentle snows that soaked into the ground. By April, the fields that had been dead were showing the first thin blades of grass. The Hartmans planted corn again. The widow Castellano bought new bees from a catalog and set up her hives. The feed store stocked its shelves with seeds and tools, and Mr. Lindquist smiled at Annie when she came in, a real smile, not a smirk. She had become, without quite intending it, the most respected farmer in the county. Not because her fields were the greenest. They were not. Her fields were fallow, given over to pasture for Greta and a few young heifers she had bought with her new money. Her wealth came from beneath the ground, from the dark, from the thing the town had called poison. On the first Sunday of May, the church held a spring Thanksgiving service. The preacher spoke about provision and gratitude, and Annie sat in her pew between the widow Castellano and Peter Voss, listening. After the service, the congregation gathered outside in the warm sunlight, and Mr. Halloran, the banker, stood on the steps and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I have an announcement." The crowd quieted. Halloran pulled a paper from his pocket. The town of Kearney, in recognition of extraordinary service to the community during the hard winter of 1881, wishes to present a testimonial to Miss Annie Bell. There was a murmur of surprise. Annie's face went hot. She had not expected this. Halloran read from the paper, his voice formal but warm. He spoke of the drought, the blizzards, the sickness. He spoke of the families who would not have survived without the provision that came from Miss Bell's cellar. He spoke of the quiet, steady generosity of a woman who had been mocked, and who had chosen to feed her mockers instead of turning them away. "And so," Halloran concluded, "it is my honor to present Miss Bell with this testimonial, signed by every family in the settlement, and to announce that the town has voted to name the new community hall after her father, Samuel Bell, in recognition of the daughter he raised." Annie stood frozen. The widow Castellano nudged her forward. She walked to the steps, and Halloran placed the rolled paper in her hands. The crowd applauded, someone cheered, and then, from the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "I have something to say." It was Mr. Lindquist. He stepped forward, his hat in his hands, his face pale and serious. The crowd parted for him, and he walked to the steps and turned to face the congregation. "I am not a man who is good at saying he was wrong," he said, "but I was wrong about Miss Bell. I called her crop poison. I refused to sell it in my store. I let the town laugh at her, and I laughed with them." His voice wavered. "And then my grandchildren ate her mushrooms last winter. My daughter-in-law told me that without Miss Bell, her children would have gone hungry, and I had to sit with that." He looked at Annie, and there were tears in his eyes. "Miss Bell, I am ashamed of what I did, and I want to say it in front of everyone. You are the finest farmer I have ever known. You are the reason this town is still standing, and I am proud to call you my neighbor." He held out his hand. Annie took it. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then the applause began, louder than before, and it went on until Annie felt her face burn and her heart swell. Peter Voss made his way through the crowd and stood beside her. He did not say anything. He just put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed, and she knew that everything he had taught her, everything he had believed in her, had come to this. That night, after the celebration had ended and the last neighbor had gone home, Annie walked down to the cellar alone. She lit the lamp and stood at the bottom of the steps, looking at the beds. They were full again, the white webbing thick and healthy, the tiny buttons beginning to push up through the straw. The dark was quiet and cool and alive. She knelt and picked a single mushroom, the smallest one she could find. She held it in her palm, turning it in the lamplight. It was perfect, white and firm and clean, a small, impossible thing that had come from rot and darkness and stubborn hope. She stood up, the mushroom still in her hand, and she thought about her father digging this cellar, about the pamphlet traded for 24 eggs, about Peter Voss and the green mold, and the blizzard, and the empty tin box. She thought about the town that had laughed and then eaten, the banker who had bowed, the dry goods man who had wept. She placed the mushroom gently back on the bed, where it would grow or rest or wait, and she blew out the lamp. The dark was not empty. It had never been empty. It had been full of life all along, waiting for someone to stoop low enough to see it. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.